Good evening, everyone, on this very unsummery evening. And thank you all for joining this Atlantic Books event for Joanne Limburg and her new book, Letters to My Weird Sisters on Autism and Feminism. I'm Karen Duffy from Atlantic Books, and it is my pleasure and privilege to be Joanne's publisher. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes before we start to introduce our two speakers. Joanne is the most versatile of writers. She's the author of 2 memoirs, a novel, and is also an acclaimed and award-winning poet. She lectures at Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, and she lives in Cambridge with her husband and son. Jill Abram is a poet, presenter, and producer who created the Stablemate series of poetry and conversation. She's director of the influential collective Malika's Poetry Kitchen, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. We're going to leave time for questions at the end of the session, so please do use the Q&A box for any questions you may have. And for those of you who haven't yet bought or borrowed Letters to My Weird Sisters, you can order a copy from Heifers in Cambridge, and they'll have signed copies later this week. And there should be a link in the chat box to their bookshop.org page. Or of course, you can order a copy from your local bookshop. Thank you very much to Jill and Joanne for what I know will be a fascinating discussion. And Joanne is going to start the session with a reading from the book.
Thank you, Karen. So, all my life, in all kinds of contexts, I've watched people sense something other about me and react accordingly. Some people back away as soon as they can or push me away. Some people narrow their eyes and try to figure me out. Some read it as vulnerability and become protective. Others read it as vulnerability and become predatory. A few people are drawn to it. One of my infant school teachers ordered me to smile. One of my junior school teachers told me not to look like that. People tell me I look furious when I'm simply trying to concentrate. People start conversations I wasn't expecting and then tell me not to look so scared. People have told me I'm too fidgety. Other people have said that I'm so still it freaks them out. Oh, and apparently I have a distinctive walk. My voice is too quiet, but also too loud. And what am I looking at all the way over there? I unsettle people. I'm uncanny. Being around me doesn't always feel like being around a fellow human being, and that discomfort rarely brings out the best in people. If you don't register someone as a fellow human being, you are less inclined to treat them like one. They're a threat or a nuisance, or an instrument, or an object, or your work, or your responsibility, or an interesting spectacle, but not a person. It's horrible being a not person. People who know themselves to be people will stand right in front of you and talk about you in the third person as if you weren't even there. You'll try and get their attention and they'll act like no one spoke. It's social death. I'm not claiming that it's a rare experience being dehumanized. You don't have to be uncanny for it to happen. On the contrary, I'm sure most of you will have been on the receiving end of it at some point. As a matter of routine, adults do it to children, men do it to women, bosses do it to subordinates, white people do it to people of color, abled people do it to disabled people, high status people do it to the people who serve them and clean up after them. Medical staff do it to patients. Anyone who walks past a homeless person on the street and doesn't acknowledge them has done it. If you're a white, middle-class, heterosexual, able-bodied cis male, it won't have happened to you so much. If you're a black, working-class, queer, disabled, trans female, then I'm aware that it will have happened to you a great deal more than it's happened to me. But this has happened to me more than you might expect, and it's happened mostly because I'm uncanny, or weird, or since my very late diagnosis, autistic. At this point, you'll be expecting a definition of autism, and the usual way of meeting this expectation would be to look it up in a diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, say, or from some other official source, an institute, a research centre, the NHS, the National Autistic Society. I'm not going to do that. First of all, you can very easily do it yourselves, and if you're interested enough to pick this book up, you probably already have. Secondly, I wouldn't want to mislead you into thinking that there is any general agreement as to what autism is. There really, really isn't. Thirdly, this is my account written under my name, and I'm not going to describe myself in someone else's terms. That is the very opposite of what I want to do. What I will try to do instead is to convey my own understanding of autism, and as I tend to think in analogies, I will draw one for you now. I'll start by asking you to picture an AA roadmap of Great Britain. If you're under 35, you might want to picture a Google map instead. This roadmap corresponds to the brain and nervous system of a non-autistic or neurotypical individual. There might be a few minor variations between individuals, but broadly speaking, most of the population is working with this sort of map. To make an autistic map, you first need to take out all the A roads. Replace these with a selection of the other roads, motorways, B roads, and the less well-travelled roads, usually referred to as unclassified. Any A roads could be replaced with any other kind of road, and the proportions will be different for every individual. You might get mostly B roads and a handful of extra motorways, in which case you will probably strike people as remarkably talented, but at the same time a little off, a little odd. On the other hand, you might lose out on the motorways altogether and end up with a baroque network of narrow, winding unclassifieds, slowing down and complicating your processing to the point where you experience significant difficulties with sensory input, emotional regulation, initiating action, and motor planning. You may be unable to use spoken language at all, may also struggle with basic self-care, and will require a high level of support from others. Most of us will fall somewhere between these two extremes, and no two of us will have the same map. What we have in common is that absence of A roads, the standard ways of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing, which non-autistic people share and can use to understand each other and navigate the world they've built for themselves.
Hello, thank you for that, Joanne.
Thank you.
If you have read anything about this book, in fact, even if you just read the title, you'll know it's Letters to My Weird Sisters, but that extract was from the front section of the book, which is called Letter to the Reader. So that's to all of us, whether we're weird sisters or not. And I really love that metaphor of the roads and the map. I think that explains the variety of people who are diagnosed or would identify as autistic. I love the idea that this, I suppose in a way it's a conceit of the book, but I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, that you have found ways to write about yourself and how it is for autistic people by writing letters to these four, mainly these four weird sisters. How did the whole concept come about?
Well, a few years ago, I read Steve Silverman's books, Neurotribes, and as he would be the first to tell you, there aren't really many women in it, but he goes into the past and he looks at people like Henry Cavendish and Nikola Tesla, and he doesn't say they're autistic because you can't diagnose someone posthumously. But, you know, he talks about them as a kind of speculative prehistory of the autistic community, if you like. And it's always important, I think, for minority communities to be able to find themselves in the past. So if you look at, for example, about the figure of Anne Lister, Gentleman Jack, you know, that's a way of queering history and bringing queer women back out of the shadows of history and putting them where they always were. So I wanted to do a similar thing for what I decided to call weird women, as a way of, partly because that's what we get thrown at us and we might as well reclaim it. And also because, again, I doesn't want to use the word autism. And so I started looking for women and I wasn't quite sure how to do it. I knew there was going to be something personal from me in it. I knew there was going to be research in it. I knew there was going to be theory in it. I wasn't sure how to put it together. And then I read a book, a fantastic book by Georgina Klieg called Blind Rage. She's a writer, an art historian. She's also registered blind in America. And Blind Rage it's a biography of Helen Keller. It's a memoir by Georgina Klieg, but it's written to Helen Keller. And it's about a reckoning with this hero who was always held up over her and the resentment she has towards her. And also just the uncovering of Helen Keller as inevitably a far more complex and interesting human being than the myth would suggest. And I like that idea. I think I partly like that idea because, okay, if I write a book about autism, it's not other people talking about us. But what I didn't want to do, what I was fed up of the thought of doing, was being what the original neurodiversity advocate Jim Sinclair calls a self-narrating zoo exhibit. I thought, I don't want to explain myself to you, F that. So I thought, right, well, I'm going to talk to other autistic women, because when I talk to other autistic women, we have a totally different conversation about it. It's just normal. It's just how we are. It's not someone going, oh, and how does it manifest itself? How very fascinating. So I thought I would talk across to other autistic women, and you can overhear our fascinating conversation if you like.
It works. It really works, I think. So how did you find the women? And having found, well, I don't know if you found a load and had to pick, but how did you find them and how did you choose them?
Well, I started looking all over the place, and I looked at nuns, for example, because I remember a friend of mine saying in passing that the end of monasticism was a disaster for neurodivergent people. And I found some, but no one individual figure I felt confident about writing to. And I looked at people you might think were sort of neurodivergent, like anchoresses, but actually, as I say, anchoresses are, they were like middle-aged women who'd taken a counselling course. So, they're actually at the centre of their communities. And I kept looking, and I wanted to include women who weren't verbal. So I started looking at the records of the local asylum, and I noticed that there was one category of person who never seemed to get out, and they were called, horrible trigger warning, horrible word, imbeciles. And I thought, I need to have a look at these women. And eventually I came across Adelheid Bloch, who was a Jewish woman who was murdered by the Nazis in T4, which was their program for eliminating disabled people from the Volk. So I had her, and I wanted to look at motherhood. And originally I was going to call it too a refrigerator mother, because the figure of the refrigerator mother sort of haunts autism discourse, because it was thought for a long time that autism was a response to a cold mother. It's just horrible, and it just traumatized generations of mothers and children and families. And then I came, when I was reading a translation, Uta Frith's translation of Asperger's original paper, Hans Asperger in Vienna, I came across Frau V, who was the mother of one of them, and she was so obviously autistic, and I really liked her. I really liked that when things got too much at home, she just went off and walked in the mountains. I thought, I love this woman. So the bit about motherhood I wrote to her. And then I looked at witches, and again, witches didn't quite fit, actually, stereotypically, but I read this wonderful book about Johannes Kepler's mother, Katharina Kepler, who was tried for witchcraft. And when I looked at his descriptions of her, how she didn't make eye contact, she talked across people, she would just speak up, she wouldn't cry like they thought a woman should. I thought, oh, okay, I'll have her. And I wasn't going to have Virginia Woolf, because I thought she is, in the most wonderful way, in many ways, a very sacred heifer. And I thought, I'm going to get in trouble if I go near her. And also, haven't we heard enough about her? But I think she's possibly one of the people you can't hear enough about. And when I read her autobiographical stuff, Moments of Being, I realized I can't ignore you, because I wanted to look at the issue of women and clothing and feminine presentation, and how as autistic women, we do that aspect of womaning wrong. So she was perfect for that.
Yeah, so she's your first recipient of the letter. And I imagine that of the four, she was the easiest to find, because you were so familiar with her work. So you didn't have to hunt for her like you did the others. And there's a line in the book: when I first read your work, I did not identify as autistic, but I did identify with you. And I think in this chapter, in this letter, it's where you kind of explore how you discovered that you are autistic. And you also recognized aspects of yourself and how others respond to you in Stephen King's Carrie and Margaret Drabble's Daphne.
Yes.
So did that also enable you to write about your own path?
It did. And sort of looking at these women and how they were pictured from the outside, and the kind of discomfort that caused me was interesting. And also the fact that both the authors, Stephen King and Margaret Drabble, felt uncomfortable about having written those characters. And I thought that is interesting in itself, because we're talking about a site of discomfort, you know, talk in a very critical theory way. And I thought that's always very generative for writing something. What is it we're uncomfortable about? What's going on here? And I thought, is it something about how, and we talk about this a lot, performativity, how femininity is so constructed and has so much work, and yet we live with this fiction at the same time that women are naturally like that. You know, naturally fragrant, naturally neat, naturally groomed.
Yeah, I know as a poet, we're always being pushed to write what we're uncomfortable with. Does the same happen in the other genres that you write in?
Yes, it certainly is for me. I think where there's something where I'm uncomfortable, or I've got stuff that's unresolved, that's where I go. So Small Pieces was a book about suicide grief, about losing my brother, which was a very difficult, knotty thing. And Woman Who Thought Too Much was about OCD. And, you know, even the book, my novel, there's A Want of Kindness, and I couldn't remember the title of my own novel for a moment. I was looking at issues of illness and also pregnancy loss and things that, you know, I felt I needed to work through myself, but I knew that other people would appreciate being worked through. And it's a way of, you know, not being alone. It's a way of communicating with the other people. I mean, this book's all about making connections, so hence the letters too. So it's almost an invitation for the reader to write back.
Yeah, and the second letter to Adelheid Block, this was my favourite, and I think, if I wasn't allowed to have a favourite, and I think the reason for that is the structure and I want to say the device, which makes it seem quite calculated, and I don't necessarily mean that, but the two repeated questions and all the different answers to that, which help divide this letter into chapters almost, but also I felt that those questions strengthened the link between you and Adelheid Block, two women who had some things in common, but there's one very clear difference. One is that, you know, you are a great master of language and she had none or very little. So talk to me about how the questions came about and the structure of this letter.
Well, I struggled with that letter. That was the one I had to rewrite. And it was partly because I did a huge amount of research for that letter, probably as much research for that letter as I did for the rest of the book put together, because I knew nothing about the history of intellectual disability or the history of the concept of idiocy. And because also, you know, it's just a technical issue, because there was so little available of Adelheid or Adelheid's life, I had to substitute that for that with the story of the figure of the that particular kind of weird woman, the one who can't speak, the one who's seen as a fool, or horrible words, idiot or imbecile or feeble-minded, all those words. And I thought the link was that I'd been measured and taken to consulting rooms and taken to clinics, and that I glitched in the system, in the educational system, as she did. And I was just trying to put myself in that helpless place. And I just remembered the sort of sick feeling of being that awkward child and hearing those questions again and again. What's the matter with you? What are we going to do with you? And I thought, God, they are really sinister, aren't they? What's the matter with you? What are we going to do with you? They're quite frightening questions.
Who would say that to you?
Adults, teachers, relatives sometimes, friends of the family, dinner ladies, school nurses. What are we going to do with you?
Did they ever find an answer? Or did you find your own?
No, actually. I mean, there were various failed answers, like move you to a different school, go to go to an elite university, have psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Just, I mean, I'm not saying that was a totally failed answer. I got something out of it, but I mean, there never is an answer. But I thought the idea of, I know what it's like to be Adelheid, because I know what it's like to find that you're a problem that has to be solved.
Yeah, yeah. There was something I learned in that chapter as well, which was I've become aware recently of the idea of the word idiot being used. I mean, I think these days we just think a stupid person, but I was already aware of the history of idiot a little bit, but I didn't know the history of imbecile. And if you'd asked me, I'd have thought imbecile was kind of worse than idiot, but it seems that in these classifications, an idiot was a sort of worse off person than an imbecile, which I found quite.
There's this horrible step diagram that shows the people standing on steps. So you've got idiot on the bottom one, and then imbecile, and then feeble-minded, that later became called moron. And I talk about the coinage of the word moron and some of the women it was first applied to.
Yeah, the history in the book.
I really enjoyed meeting, I'll give her proper name, Emma Wolverton.
So letter number 3 is, as you mentioned, to Frau V. And this enables you to talk about motherhood. Talk about, to us now, the difference between autistic mothers and autism mothers.
Well, an autistic mother is like me, a mother who is herself autistic, and an autism mother, although so some people object to the term, a lot of autistic advocates, object to the term, but it's out there. Autism mother or autism mom, mother of an autistic person. And there's obviously, as you might imagine, there's considerable overlap between the two groups. But I'm in the relatively, possibly not unusual position, but unspoken about position of being an autistic mother of a non-autistic child. But either way, I think, and again, I was referring to this with the refrigerator mother, autism discourse is always, there are always mothers there. Whether the autistic people want them to be there or not, whether the mothers want to be there or not. It's always autistic people and their mothers.
And I understand that a lot of autistic mothers find out or realise or get diagnosed when they're seeking help for their children.
Yeah, it's quite a common way for it to happen, yes. Because women tend to go, girls tend to go under the radar. So we're far more likely to be diagnosed later, as are men who don't have that stereotypical presentation.
Just expand a bit for those who don't know what a refrigerator mother is or was supposed to be.
Well, there are two sort of founding papers in autism. One is Asperger's paper, and the other one came out in the 40s in America by a man called Leo Kanner. And he described these first children. He also described their parents, and he thought of the parents as rather mechanical and cold. And in one of his early papers, he uses the phrase that these children were in refrigerators that did not defrost. And of course, this was post-war America, sort of when, everyone's starting to have these refrigerators and big cars. And so that's very much sort of object in the general discourse. And Bruno Bettelheim then took up this idea of the refrigerator mother and wrote this book called The Empty Fortress, about how children how autistic children were responding to their parenting, the way people he'd seen in a concentration camp responded to being in a concentration camp. And so for a long time, and in some countries still, it was thought to be caused by some kind of maternal rejection of the child, even if it was unconscious. You can imagine the total head fuck of someone, of you being a perfectly loving mother, and someone saying, well, unconsciously, you must have, rejected your child, and awful treatments where they would force mother and child to sort of look each other in the eye, and the demonization of a whole generation of mothers of autistic people. And it's an atrocity, really.
I like the way you flip that idea, and I'm sure you're not the only person to have done it, to say that the mothers actually know their children and know they don't want to be hugged or looked
Yes.
at or whatever.
Exactly. I mean, I remember my mother saying when I was small, I wasn't particularly cuddly. And, you know, if you know your child and you're responsive to your child, you're not going to force something on them they don't want.
Yeah. I mean, I have two sets of friends who each have two sons, and when they were little, one son in each family loved being hugged and the other didn't. So I would hug one and not the other. And I always used to worry that if anybody looked from the outside, they'd think I'd loved one more than the other. But they knew, and the parents knew, and I knew that I loved them equally and respected what, you know, the different ways they like to be greeted.
Yeah, I think there's this phrase that's come into language recently, love language. People have different love languages. So some people are very huggy, and whereas an autistic person might come up to you and tell you all about their favorite thing. And that's them giving something to you. I mean, you might misinterpret it, but that's what it is.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like the fact also that all these boys now queue up to hug me when I see them. The fourth letter is to Katerina Kepler. And a lot of this is about how autistic people kind of move through the world not meeting expected behaviour. Things like facial expression, eye contact, emotion, expressing emotion, the bluntness of their speech. So talk a little bit about Katerina.
Well, Katerina was the mother of Johannes Kepler, the mathematician and astronomer. And she was, well, it's hard to sort of have these class equivalents. I guess she was a relatively middle-class woman in Limburg in Germany in the early modern period. So she had some property, but not much. And life was a struggle. Life was a struggle for everyone. And things would go wrong. People would die or get ill. Animals would die, get ill. Crops would fail. And you would look for an explanation. And sometimes that explanation would be, well, so-and-so bewitched me. And it also became a sort of way of just the sort of tensions in the town boiling over. And she was a prime candidate for this. She was the oldest woman in Limburg when it happened. She had been effectively without her husband since he walked out on her years ago. And she spoke her mind. She put people's, when you look at how her son describes her and how people describe her, you get a woman who's, you know, not well-meaning, but she puts people's backs up. She misreads signals. She carries on talking to them when they don't want her to talk to them. She keeps knocking on their door when they don't want her to knock on their door. She doesn't pick up. And so you can see that she's vulnerable in that way. And also she doesn't sugarcoat things. It was when women were put on trial for witchcraft, a great deal of weight was put on repentance. And the way a woman repents is to cry womanly tears. And she wouldn't. She said, no, I won't. Why should I? And she wouldn't confess. She said, I know I didn't do it, and I'm not going to say I did. And in the end, I think, you know, between her determination and her son's determination, after persecution, they gave up pretty much.
Yeah. And was she lucky? Was it just luck to have her son to advocate for her?
I think so, yes. I mean, because he was meticulous about it. He turned all those gifts and all the learning that he had onto defending her. And he was better at it than, you know, the lawyers they had for the state.
And it seems quite typical for neurotypical people to advocate for neurodiverse people, especially those who have learning difficulties and can't advocate for themselves. But as autism is being recognised more and more in people who don't have intellectual disabilities and can advocate for themselves, there's almost conflict brewing, isn't there? Nothing about us without us.
And of course, you know, some people with intellectual disabilities are a limit case for that, because they can't advocate for themselves, at least not in words. I mean, I presume that they can communicate. So there are always going to be some people who are going to have people put forward their interests for them. but there are still many of us who can speak for ourselves. And even then, you know, there are times when I'm not in such a good way and I need someone to speak, when I just feel scared or overwhelmed. I think in the Adelheid Bloch chapter, I say sometimes you're just too scared to talk, and it doesn't matter, you know, how much of a master of language you are, it deserts you and you feel helpless, or you can't find the right words, or you can't find the way to express yourself in a way that gets people to know you need help and that you're not trying to be awkward. Because one of the things I talk about in the Frau V chapter is a lot of autistic people, me included, we struggle with healthcare professionals because the way we present ourselves as patients isn't how you're supposed to do it.
Yes, and I think also, you know, autistic people are often viewed as being awkward, and people don't, whether they know you're autistic or not, they don't kind of come over to your side and try and see why you might be behaving in that way. It's just, you're not behaving in the way I want, you're written off. Yeah,
I mean, we do, like, you know, like Katharina Kepler behaved in ways that annoyed people. And I mean, I don't think the answer is to deny that it's annoying. The answer is to get beyond that, I think.
Yeah, and in this chapter as well, you talk through the book about feminine performativity, as you just mentioned, the cries, and but in this chapter as well, you particularly talk about the difference between male and female, the difference that when class and colour of skin and that sort of thing come into play.
Yeah, and that's something we've seen recently, that without mentioning any names or particular events, that women have relatively few channels that are considered acceptable way to express ourselves. Women of colour have even fewer. So what happens is a woman of, you know, and I'm not going to, this isn't my lane, so I'm not going to stay on it too long, but as we know what happens, a woman of colour will say she's harmed, and someone will say, why are you shouting at me? Why are you being such a scary woman?
Yeah, I also like the quote that you put in the book and discussed from Nicola Clark in The Guardian 2016 about the capacity and interest in conformity.
Yes, I think you could say with autistic people, it's not that we don't know the rules, it's just that we think they're ridiculous and we can't be bothered.
I think it's both, really, that there's some that you can't be bothered and some that you simply don't know.
Yeah, I think that there are some places where I just literally don't know where I am, and others where I think that's ridiculous, why should I? Because if you think about, you know, the fictional weird figure Bartleby, the scrivener in Herman Melville's story, he just keeps saying, I would prefer not to. And the autistic bit of me would prefer not to, whatever it is.
Talking of which, who is SGJ?
SGJ is Socially Gracious Joanne, and she is partly working this evening as I speak. Although she's been with me so long, it's hard to tell how much of her is spontaneous. She is the persona I constructed over time, part consciously, part unconsciously, so that I wouldn't, like Katharina Kepler, be literally or metaphorically denounced as a witch, so that I wouldn't be ostracized, so that I wouldn't be mocked, so that people wouldn't be offended by me when I hadn't meant to offend them. She does that smoothing over that women are assumed to do automatically, and that people only know. It's one of those many social rules that only become visible in the breach. It's what Smile Love is all about. We're supposed to smile and make nice and just move things around emotionally and physically and in a nurturing sort of way to just make for a nice environment. And it's niceness, and it's and niceness is very white and middle class. It's not the same as kindness. You can be kind and, you know, downright rude, and you can be nice and horrible. It's about niceness.
And being her takes a toll. I like what you say about she stops you being the best version of your autistic self in order to be an inferior version of a non-autistic woman.
Yes, well, that's exactly it. And whenever I'm I think I can pass pretty perfectly for short periods of time. So I think I can, perfectly do being a customer in a restaurant or a passenger on a bus or a person in a shop. And I do have to consciously think about all of these things. Am I making eye contact? Am I smiling? What's the tone of my voice? But an evening of small talk with people I don't know and have very little in common with. I mean, nobody likes that, but for me, it's absolute agony, and I can feel it beginning to fray. And I can tell from people's responses to me that it's fraying, that either I'm not doing it enough or I'm doing it too much.
Well, now that we've met or been introduced to socially gracious Joanne, let's hear another reading from the book. And just to remind people listening, we're going to have a Q&A after this reading. So if you want to ask anything, please put that in the Q&A box. And so here Joanne now is going to read.
So, SJG is middle class. SJG is white. SJG can pass for neurotypical. The protection she affords would not be available to me if I were unable to speak or to suppress the characteristics which mark me out as other. In a post on their blog, Cussin' and Discussin', the autism advocate Mel Baggs explained that in a society which judges people by their ability to conform to an emotionally muffled, verbally indirect, distinctly middle-class mode of relating, people with developmental disabilities must always be at a terrible disadvantage. And this is Mel. People with developmental disabilities might find it harder to pretend we are feeling something we are not. We might find it harder to detach ourselves from what we are feeling. We might find it harder to act as if we don't notice something that is happening. We are sometimes more direct or blunt in our communication styles than usual. We might find it hard to act like someone is our social better, even if we are trying to be respectful. We might find it hard to speak indirectly or abstractly about something we are feeling right now. We might find it hard to speak at all if we are feeling strongly and may communicate through other means. We might find it hard to pretend we perceive the world differently than we do. We might find it hard to be abstract about something that's very concrete to us. This is a passage from a post entitled Nice Lady Therapists and the War Against Human Emotion. The term nice lady therapist was coined by another autistic blogger, Rabbi Ruti Regan, as a way of describing certain female professionals who harm the children they're supposed to be helping, who inflict invalidation trauma, but do so in ways so subtle and so generally acceptable that they may not even be aware they are doing it themselves. The nice lady therapist will tell their charges that whatever they do to us is by definition nice and good for us, and that we like it, and that they love us, and that they are rescuing us, and that we are grateful, end of quote. They work in brightly coloured therapy rooms, in sessions filled with toys and praise and rewards and smiles, and yet, quote, every interaction with them is degrading in a way that's hard to pinpoint and hard to recover from, end of quote. These interactions include treating a child as if they were younger than they are, forcing a child to do something frightening or painful while forbidding them to express pain or fear, as it hurts their feelings to see a child upset. Sometimes it's a matter of being expected to accept intensely bad advice as though it's insight, such as being told that the way to make friends is to try harder with the kids who are rejecting and bullying them. Sometimes it's even touching a child invasively and against their express wishes while telling them it must be for their own good, because by definition, anything the nice lady therapist says or does is good and nice and nurturing. And horrible, and sorry if that particular paragraph was difficult for anyone to hear. When I read these posts by Baggs and Regan, they chilled me to the bone, not just because I remembered what had sometimes been done to me, but because I saw for the first time exactly who SJG was trying to be, and that it was not good to be her. SJG does not respect my experience or my feelings as an autistic person. When I am being SJGJ, I'm treating myself as a little girl playing teacher treats the recalcitrant doll she must move around, speak for, and chastise. She forces me to do and tolerate things that make me uncomfortable, unhappy, and drained, while telling me she's only acting for my own good and for the good of people around me. She tells me that my resistance to her comes from a side of me that must be disavowed, the side that is identified with those other autistics, such as Mel Baggs, whose fate I'm privileged, through SGJ's good offices, to escape. SGJ wants me to feel good that I'm not Mel Bags. She wants me to pity and distance myself from them and other autistic people like them. She wants me to do this even though Bags' activism and the activism of other people like them has helped me to find myself and to write these very words. SGJ is the personification of my internalized ableism, and as such, he perpetuates harm not only to me, but also to my fellow autistic people who cannot or do not pass as neurotypical, and who do not or cannot let it go when autistic people as a class are harmed or erased or insulted.
Fabulous, thank you very much. Well, I'm relieved that we have some questions, and the quality of the questions is amazing. So the first one is from Sybil Ruth, who says, despite the increasing recognition of the different presentation of autism in women, do you think this era is actually a worse time for neurodivergent females because of increasingly strict social demands on women to perform femininity?
In some ways, I think it's both better and worse, because there are options. Because on the one hand, you've got this very Kim Kardashian kind of feminism, which of course some women love, and it will be someone's special interest somewhere, you can bet, but can seem very constraining. And also with the Instagram, Snapchat, so on culture, appearances seem to be more important than ever, and a certain way of performing female. There's that sort of love you babes kind of stuff. On the other hand, I think that again, you know, the very same forces, the internet and so on, has given women a range, and girls a range of ways to present themselves and a range of ways to describe themselves. I think it's great that you can now say that you're non-binary or non-conforming or whatever, that you have this vocabulary, and you'll see young women, you know, whether they identify as female or not. Well, they're not young women if they're non-binary, you know, but presenting themselves in these very different ways, in these sort of manga ways, and these fangirl ways, and these gothy ways, and you know, I think it's just great and amazing that there are all these ranges. So it's both better and worse. I think it's differently bad. I think at least we're talking about it now. In our day, there was no vocabulary for this stuff. And that was like having a gag on.
Claire Brown says, Joanne, your description of being hyper aware of social behaviours sounds like exercises beginner writers are encouraged to try to help them create credible characters and situations. Do you think that, ironically, many neurodiverse people understand social behaviours far better than the unaware neurotypical majority?
I have heard this said, you know, quite a lot there's a number of autistic women who actually go into psychology, and autistic men as well, and then subsequently did discover their status, and it's because they're interested in it. They study it, and they work out the codes, and they work out the systems, and they work out the patterns, and yeah, they become very aware of it. I mean, if you can do something easily, you don't need to think about it. And, you know, I have seen it said, for example, that maybe Jane Austen was autistic. And, you know, that sounds counterintuitive, but it's also not counterintuitive, because, you know, what was she doing? She was sitting to one side and she was watching these people go on, and how they went on. And again, if you think about that essay some years ago that Oliver Sacks wrote about Temple Grandin, anthropologist on Mars, that was how she described herself. Yeah, it's a motivation to study people and think about it. And there are also quite a number of actors who are neurodivergent. And again, you know, what do actors do with their craft? They look at people and they pick up a mannerism here and an expression there and a walk there, and they put it together. And so there are some, well, for Anthony Hopkins, for example, some very gifted neurodivergent actors out there.
Oh, does he identify as neurodivergent?
Oh, yes, he does.
Oh, I didn't know that. So Anne Manuel, who is in the US, you've talked a little bit about this, but do you have any more to say about how autism in women intersects with class expectations and norms?
Yes, Yes, I think so. I think I actually had a conversation with Kate Fox about this that went into my book. And again, it was a matter of, in some ways it's easier, in some ways it's not, because I was surrounded by nice women and I was kind of forced in the end, you know, kicking and screaming, to submit to this nice womanhood. But now when I take socially gracious Joanne out into the world, people are terribly nice to her, terribly nice to the nice middle-class white lady. Whereas Kate was saying she could channel the sort of northern woman, the blunt northern Yorkshire woman. And that can be quite useful for getting your way through. People aren't as nice to you, people don't respond as well to you. I think middle-class discourse is exceptionally oblique. I mean, the fact that I'm Jewish and we tend to be direct has tempered that a bit for me. But I find it the hardest social language to speak. But again, I think it will compound it. You know, if you're a working class woman, you know, you might have less access to services you need. Your family will have find it hard to access the services you need because you have to speak that middle class language in order to get the services. That's the irony of it. Also, people aren't as nice to people who are not middle class and white. So that'll be compounded. And, you know, and I have to say that in a very material way, economically, I've been cushioned from what might have been the consequences of being as autistic as I am. And that's very important to say that. You know, so I haven't, you know, been on benefits. I haven't wound up in a mental hospital because I had nowhere else to go. And it's because I had that cushion, and that cushion, yes, it was partly social, but it was also economic. So it intersects in all sorts of different ways.
Exactly. I was going to say. We've got time for some more questions if people want to put any more in the Q&A box. Here's one from Karen. Do you envisage writing to any more Weird Sisters, or what are you working on now? And she wants you to know that she adored Letters to My Weird Sisters.
Thank you very much.
She said it's the most enjoyable book on autism she's read since self-investigating the subject. I finished it just after receiving my diagnosis a month ago, and it felt weirdly comforting.
Oh, I'm so pleased. That's just what I wanted it to be for people. Thank you. And that's been comforting to me to hear that back. Well, I am looking at some Weird Sisters, though I won't be writing to them. I'm looking at a woman called Sarah Scott, who was a very serious 18th century blue stocking. And she wrote a best-selling book called Millennium Hall that was about a community of women who got together, pooled their independent resources and lived in a rational and sort of godly and virtuous way, and did good works. And she tried to reproduce this community in real life. And of course, because of real life things like health and money and people getting on each other's nerves, it didn't work. And I thought there's such a story in the gap between that aspiration and the reality. And part of it is quite pertinent to sort of what we're talking about at the moment, how can these sort of middle-class white do-gooding women avoid doing harm in their middle-class white do-gooding crusades?
Just trying to get my head around that.
Yeah, if you see what I mean, because one of the very interesting things in Millennium Hall is it's done in that very classic style where a visitor comes and is shown round, and he's shown round to sort of these poor elderly people in their almshouses that these women have got in, and these young girls they're training up to be virtuous wives of farmers. And every time we talk to someone, they go, "Oh, God bless these ladies. They've explained to me why I shouldn't behave like this and how I should be more godly. And I'm so grateful to them." And I thought, I wonder what they say behind their backs.
Yeah. So what form will this book take?
It'll be a novel.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all the questions that we've got. So I always like, when I present an event, I think it's best to end on the words of the author. So I will do some thank yous now to Karen and Kirsty from Atlantic Books, who've made this event happen, to Heifers, who have given their support as the event bookseller, and I think Kirsty might put the link for Heifers in the chat again, so that you can all go and buy the book. So thanks, of course, to the audience who've turned up to listen to us. I think we've lost one person in the last hour, so that's pretty good going, I would say. And so, Joanne, you're actually going to read us a poem.
Yes, I'm going to read a poem from the Autistic Alice. So when I first wrote about my autism, I wrote about it using Lewis Carroll's Alice books, because I'd loved it as a child. And there's something about Lewis's Alice and also Lewis Carroll's Alice, and also Tennyson's Alice with her stare. That's kind of neurodivergent.
Well, thanks to you, Joanne, and you get the final word.
Thank you. The Alice case. The problem with Alice, the caterpillar says, is her rigidity of thought. Yes, says Humpty Dumpty, and her lack of empathy. Indeed, says the caterpillar, her mind blindness. Yes, says Humpty Dumpty, her inability to read faces. Indeed, says the caterpillar, or tone of voice. And then, says Humpty Dumpty, there's the flatness of her affect. Alongside, says the caterpillar, the strangeness of her prosody, as well as, says Humpty Dumpty, her adherence to routine. It's not forgetting, says the caterpillar, her repetitive behaviours. Or her failure, says Humpty Dumpty, to understand a joke. Or her lack, says the caterpillar, of any feel for metaphor. Or her inability, says Humpty Dumpty, to hold a proper conversation. Excuse me, says Alice, may I say something? Of course, says the caterpillar, you may say something. Yes, says Humpty Dumpty, and we'll tell you why it's wrong.